Aban 13th in the Persian calendar or November 4th in the English calendar contains a multitude of symbolic meanings and realities. It marks a day that carries a historical significance. In a span of a couple of decades, 3 separate events occurred on this day that not only did they change the foundation of modern Iran, but also dealt a blow to the contemporary world order and the U.S. hegemony as we used to know it prior to 1979. U.S. greed, corruption of the Pahlavi regime in Iran and its dependence on the United States, firm resistance of the people of faith that relied on the insight of Imam Khomeini as a revolutionary leader, the presence of the young generation on the scene, and the valor and boldness of the revolutionary generation against the United States, whose face had been made up to look formidable, these are all meanings that are embodied by the Aban 13th. In November 1979, Iranian citizens took 52 Americans in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran for 444 days. Americans were shocked and outraged, but it would have come as no surprise to those who remembered or took part in the coup that overthrew the nationalist government of the Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953. It was concocted in that very same American embassy in Tehran. In historical context, Americans have not bothered much about the betrayal of democracy in Iran in order to create a client regime whose purpose would be to further pursue the so-called U.S. national security interests, but they were kept in the dark about this crisis. Indeed, 13th of Aban is one of these dates that contains a huge number of important points and issues that are not only historical but rather part of our current issues. To take a closer look at the events that Aban 13th represents, stay with us on this edition of Iran Today. 13th of Aban also marks the anniversary of 2 other important events in the history of contemporary Iran. On that day, in 1964, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi forced Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini into exile, first to Turkey and then to Najaf, Iraq. The Imam returned to Iran triumphantly on February 1, 1979, after the Shah had gone into exile on January 16, 1979. He was sent to exile because of a speech delivered to the people and seminaries of Qom. He voiced his objection to the legal immunity of American agents.
I was looking at the documents that have also been printed. It said that the person in charge of the desk of the CIA organization on November 11 came to Iran. At that time, Isfahan was the main center for the councils because it was more secure. He went there and ordered the Imam to be exiled.
At the time, Americans had tens of thousands of agents in Iran. They were political, security, and military agents. They were among the people who used to manage Iran in the army, in intelligence organizations, planning centers, and etc. Imam Khomeini said that if a low-ranking American agent insulted and stomped on an Iranian prominent religious scholar in the country and committed whatever crime he wished, the Iranian legal system would remain totally neutral and nobody would have the right to stop him.
The reforms intended by the US in Iran, which we call first the land reforms and then the White Revolution, were completely defined in line with the interests of the US. In this historical period, the United States had come to the conclusion that in order to prevent Iran from entering the group of pro-Soviet countries, it should carry out economic and cultural reforms and somehow develop the economic environment of Iranians and bring them in line with liberal democratic views. Because of this, religious practices in Iran considered these reforms to be against the native and Islamic atmosphere of the country, and it's from this point onwards that religious movements, especially the Imam, are looking for a serious criticism of the White Revolution that was intended by the Shah.
Therefore, they arrested the Imam immediately and transferred him to Tehran. Ayatollah Khomeini's objection was rooted in a sense of religiosity. It was rooted in national and Islamic pride, and it relied on public support. Although the people were unaware of their situation in the beginning, when they heard his message, they supported the Imam. It was that public support which led to the victory of the Iranian nation 14 years later.
During the Pahlavi period, they wanted to do anything. Oil contracts, consortiums, they did everything. Whose loss was this? The nation, of course. Now that there has been a revolution and that the Pahlavi regime has disappeared, it is normal for countries that have interests here, such as England, France, Germany, and especially the United States, to abandon it. But just one day after the victory of the revolution, some of our islands were occupied by the Americans.
Speaking of the public support, it was also on November 4, 1978, that a gathering of teenage students on the campus of the University of Tehran was attacked by the Shah's security forces. They were staging a peaceful rally calling for the return home from exile of their beloved leader, Imam Khomeini. The clash began with tear gas and then by bullets. Every year on this day, also known as Pupil Day, Iranians remember the massacre of a number of Tehran's students by the army of the Shah, including students as young as 13. That event made it clear that the confrontation between the Pahlavi regime and the Iranian people had entered its final stage, and that it could end only if the king was removed from power.
There were important points in the relationship between America and Iran which caused a feeling of anger amongst the youth and especially the Muslim student followers of the Imam's line. The most important event before the formation of the Islamic Revolution was the coup that the Americans carried out against the national and legal government of Iran. It happened during the time of Dr. Mossadegh against Iran. The Americans tried to destroy his government, which had come to power with the support of the people because it had somehow endangered their interests in Iran and they wanted to bring back the Shah.
A few months later, on the occasion of the anniversary of Imam Khomeini's exile and the massacre of students, once again Iranian youth entered the arena and astonished the world. November 4th marks the day, 43 years ago, when Islamic students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 69 people. 17 of them were released at various times, but the remaining 52 remained captive for 444 days. It's worth mentioning that the day the U.S. Embassy was captured, the American administration was several times more formidable and prestigious than today. The United States has lost a great deal of its prestige in recent years.
When we look at the historical aspect, we see a background in which America played a role in the history of Iran. Well, the years after the Safavid period, when European countries seriously entered their relations with Iran, practically from the period of Reza Shah onwards, we see the Americans, and before this, most of the European countries, especially England, played a role. We can see the climax of this story from the coup that happened and the fall of Mossadegh's government. There's a famous saying that the only country in which a coup did not happen is the United States, because it does not have an embassy there.
The event was a watershed in Iran-US relations, with its impact still felt today. The main consequence of that event has been that the Islamic Republic, the most important country in West Asia, and the United States, the global superpower, have not had diplomatic relations since the administration of Jimmy Carter. Moreover, over 4 decades of crises and scandals have marked Iran out as a graveyard for U.S. presidential ambition. This enmity has been further amplified by interest groups seeking to leverage U.S. policy for their own ends. While the Pahlavi lobby has faded away, organizations like the American Israel Public Affairs Committee have since sought to reflect U.S. policy towards Iran through the lens of Israel's regional security concerns. Israeli objectives in the Persian Gulf have evolved over time, often in ways which have not aligned with those of the U.S. governments. As the Biden administration soon discovered, the cumulative effects of a predecessor's actions can spill over and make it difficult to embark on a new course.
We have an interpretation in our hadith which means that you should be wary of cleverness of the believer because he looks with the light of God and in that light examines the phenomena. Certainly one of the most faithful personalities of our time was Imam Khomeini, and he truly studied the world and phenomena with God's light and finally saw clarity. The students who made this great embassy event said in their memoirs that they had not realized the greatness of it at the time.
The mentioned enmity between Washington and Tehran took a strange course, as the 1979 U.S. Embassy takeover got so bad for President Carter that he succumbed to the pressure by his advisors and resorted to a covert military attack to rescue the hostages. They deployed their spies inside the country. They prepared the ground. They spoke to different mercenaries. They considered different places for their operation. They attacked the country with their helicopters and airplanes. The plan was to regroup in Tabas, northeast of Tehran, rescue the hostages, and take them to the U.S. But the unforeseen events happened in Tabas, and Allah the Exalted destroyed their prestige, according to Ayatollah Khomeini. Their airplanes and helicopters caught fire, and they were forced to return to America from Tabas. These are the events that the 13th of Aban represents.
We can address the question of what and why the capture of the spy den, or as the Americans interpreted, the embassy, in two parts. The first part has to do with the American performance from 1941 to 1979. We can go back to the period of Muhammad Shah when they brought missionaries and laid the groundwork. Building schools, building churches, for example, the Anjani Church in Tehran was the center of Freemasonry. After that, they entered the field of power and government by sending military advisors to the army as a program called Truman's Four Principles. In fact, they looked at all the villages and the situation of the country to make a plan to destroy the production of the society and turn the country into a consumer society.
Here are some examples of the U.S. schemes against Iran extracted from the shredded documents found in the embassy. 1. U.S. attempts between 1943 to 1947 to maintain the Pahlavi regime by reining in the opposition forces as a means to strengthen the U.S. footing in Iran and prevent the USSR adventures into the country. 2. The U.S. and access to Iran's oil reserves meant that the U.S. relied on increasing political favor in Iran to become UK's partner in Iranian oil. 3. On the occasion of the 1953 coup in Iran, the U.S. kicked out the nationalist administration of Mossadegh in favor of the U.S. servant Mohammad Reza Pahlavi and his regime so that its interests in Iran would be met. 4. The U.S. attempt to change economic structure and development of Iran led to the Shah's land reform policy, which is one of the changes that, according to Imam Khomeini, damaged domestic product and hindered the path of Iran's independence. 5. The advancement of economic-military relations between Iran and the U.S. to secure the Pahlavi regime can be seen in the multi-million-dollar arms deal signed between Iran and the U.S. on June 21, 1947. There is plenty more right after a quick diversion into world media. Here is how it looks on the papers. CNN says Iran says it will sue U.S. alleging direct involvement in protests. Iran said Saturday it would take legal action against the United States and accusing it of direct involvement in the protests sweeping the country. Tehran also warned the United Kingdom and Saudi Arabia would not be ignored by the Islamic Republic's judiciary system for their role in hosting and supporting TV networks such as BBC Persian and Iran International, which it claimed had urged protesters to destroy public and private properties. Anti-government protests have gripped Iran since the September 16th death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, who died after being pulled off the streets of Tehran by morality police and taken to a re-education center for lessons in modesty. The state news agency IRNA reported on Saturday that the Justice Department has been tasked to file a lawsuit in order to investigate the damages and meddling inflicted by the U.S. direct involvement in the unrest. It also reported the claims against the BBC and Iran International made by the deputy head of the Iranian judiciary and secretary of the country's High Council for Human Rights, Kazem Gharibabadi. Al Jazeera says Iran and U.S. set for UN confrontation over Mahsa Amini protests. A rare Iranian joint intelligence report claims arrested journalists who reported on Mahsa Amini's death were trained by the U.S. abroad. The Iranian intelligence community claimed the U.S. has spent billions of dollars over the years to create a network of sympathetic organizations and individuals, holding many gatherings and courses to teach hybrid wars and soft overthrow of the Iranian establishment. These all-paid courses, it said, have been held in Italy, South Africa, Turkey and the United Arab Emirates, among others, with or without the knowledge of those countries' governments. The report uses the initials of two female Iranian journalists, whom it says were trained by the courses of the U.S. mafia regime in foreign countries and played the role of being the first sources to manufacture news for foreign media on developments concerning Amini that led to the protests. The reporters accused by Iranian intelligence are Nilufar Hamadi and Elahe Mohammadi, who were arrested shortly after protests broke out last month and remain imprisoned in Evin prison in Tehran. Hamadi was among the first to report on Amini's death at the hospital, while Mohammadi traveled to Amini's hometown of Saqqez to report on her funeral. The intelligence report also alleges that CIA officials met with Kurdish separate groups in neighboring Iraq's northern Erbil region in late September to ask them to amplify their role in Iran's unrest. The father of the Islamic Republic, Imam Khomeini, hailed the heroic takeover of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran in 1979 by Muslim students as the Second Revolution. The U.S. Embassy in Tehran, long detested by Iranians for its highly suspicious and undiplomatic activities, turned out to be an espionage den. The seized gadgets and documents revealed startling facts. The Americans, in league with certain treasonous elements in Iran, were plotting to overthrow the Islamic Republic system. The shredded documents, painstakingly restored by the dedicated students, showed that the U.S. mission in Tehran was the headquarters of a vast network of espionage spread in the region for spying upon regional states, and especially the Soviet Union.
Let's go back and look at the historical and social conditions of the First Revolution. We were a country in which the Islamic Revolution had just happened. A very large revolution against colonialism had happened. We should not compare it with now, which is relatively stable. At that historical moment, each of those countries that had left Iran and their interest in Iran were shortened, were looking to get back what they had lost. The revolutionaries approached this issue very carefully. They could not allow a coup against the revolution to be carried out, or the events that happened in the border regions of Iran, especially in Kurdistan and Khuzestan. When they do the analysis, they see that the American embassy is involved in all cases, and this leads to the occupation of the embassy.
This was indeed a great blow to Washington, and that explains for the avowed hostility of Uncle Sam towards the Iranian people, against whom none of the plots have succeeded, beginning with the 8-year war launched by Saddam of Iraq's repressive Ba'ath minority regime to the thousands of unilateral sanctions which the U.S. has illegally imposed on the people and the government of Iran.
After the 1979 revolution, we see a set of powers and energies that are released that impact the region and the world in the following years and decades. Its effects can be seen at the next stage in the downing of the Global Hawk drone by Iran's IRGC's missile. We can see the next stage in the missile attack on Ain al-Assad, which is one of US's military bases in the region. The cases where the IRGC Navy comes and arrests the American forces without any fear, and then the media reports of it. All this is the continuation of the same story, that there's a revolutionary line by which we can stand up to the American government without fear and show our newfound confidence.
13th of Aban is rightly called the Day of National Campaign Against Global Arrogance. On this occasion, commander of the IRGC Major General Hossein Salami said, "The United States has been a factory for creating dictators in the world. From the Philippines to Sudan, Chile and the Shah of Iran, the ruling sultans of many Arab countries, in Latin America, they're all over the world. The United States established the imperial regime in Iran with that coup d'etat and removed freedom, constitutionalism, and all these concepts from the political landscape of Iran.
It's naive to think that after 44 years of relationship like this, America wants to provide our interests now. Our experience in the nuclear issues showed that after that agreement, by the way, Iran had fulfilled its obligations, but the Americans relented and trampled on Iran's interests. Sanctions continued, interventions in Iran also continued, and we were constantly dealing with the losses caused by America's presence. One of the most important issues, which is ironically very current, is the riots that are happening. When our security and political officials investigate, they easily find the roots of these disturbances in the footsteps of America, which incites ethnic groups and makes the fault lines in Iran more colorful, which leads to the division of Iran.
The U.S. State Department recently released a trove of confidential documents that disclosed more details of Britain's role in the 1953 coup in Iran, an issue London strongly denied in the past. The publication of the documents put an end to decades of internal debates and public controversy after a previous official collection omitted all references to the role of American and British intelligence in the ouster of the legal government of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh.
This is how we have an unequal war, and we did not start this war. They are the initiators. They started this act, but the resistance is ours. Starting a war and ending it is up to them, not us. They want an Iran like Egypt and Jordan or the same old Pahlavi regime, to have the powers in their hands again.
Political and social events have two factors when they happen, a mental factor and an objective factor. Regarding the mental factor, the mental background of the Iranians was not positive at all regarding the Americans. In addition to that, America was one of the countries that helped Shah to escape, that is, this caused the anger of many Iranian youth and students. After fleeing from Iran, the Shah had gone to several countries and was not accepted. But the United States had accepted the Shah personally, and naturally, like any other revolution, the Iranian youth wanted to extradite the king, wanted his property to be returned to Iran and to be tried. At the same time, the United States was not willing to return the Shah to Iran, and this added to the anger of the Iranians towards the United States.
Last year, on the anniversary of 13th of Aban, the Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi referred to decades of hostile U.S. acts against the country and said that the U.S. enmity with the Iranian nation goes back not to 4, but to 7 decades ago. In the first 3 decades, the Americans managed to plunder the Iranian people's assets with coups and support public rulers. But since the victory of the Islamic Revolution, the Iranian nation has been the one emerging victorious in the face of these animosities.
The Imam strongly believed that the American embassy is a spy den, and in order to open up and clarify the different dimensions of the spy den, the people who cooperated with the Americans after the Islamic Revolution, their roots should be found and their agents should also be found. And only after that, an agreement should be made. The important point in Imam's mind was that the colonialism that we were trying to destroy still has basis in Iran. That is, our revolution had not fully occurred. Why? Because it was after this incident that we identified the main base of colonialism in Iran and confronted it.
According to Jennifer Lowenstein, an American activist on human rights, the U.S. role in 1953 coup in Iran is a history deliberately blotted out of American historical memory across successive generations, with the complicity of its public education system, its media establishment, and consecutive political administrations based in Washington, D.C. She states that had our history with Iran been based on trust, fairness, and cooperation, it is improbable that we would be facing the crisis that threaten us now. Some of us understand that what the centers of power in the United States genuinely fear is an independent Iran, whose influence is growing across the Middle East. Multiple IAEA inspections, reports, and close readings of the JCPOA have certified and recertified Iran's compliance with the treaty. A simple solution would be for an international JCPOA on how to contain the United States curb its bullying, diffuse its threats, and undo its perception of itself as a beacon of enlightenment to be appreciated and deferred to by all other nations. How else will we stop the existential threat to the world posed by this mighty nuclear monster?